And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode explores Karl Marx, one of the most debated and influential thinkers in history. His work is examined with depth, nuance, and contemporary relevance. Rather than a polemical takedown or a simplistic celebration, this audio essay offers a measured and engaging exploration of Marx's ideas, tracing their evolution from Hegelian idealism to historical materialism, from the critique of capitalism to revolutionary thought, and their influence on modern society. The episode also considers critiques from liberal economists, anarchist theorists, and contemporary post-Marxist thinkers, presenting a balanced engagement with Marxism. Whether you are a seasoned scholar of political economy or a curious listener exploring Marx for the first time, this episode provides a thought-provoking look at the economic and philosophical questions that continue to shape our world. For further reading and ways to support us, go to the deeperthinkingpodcast.podbean.com. Let's dive in. Karl Marx's influence stretches far beyond the confines of political theory, shaping the way we understand history, economics, and social struggle. His ideas are not relics of the 19th century, but continue to animate debates about inequality, labour, and the future of capitalism. This essay begins by exploring the foundations of his thought, examining the forces that shaped his intellectual development and the key insights that emerged from his early writings. Born in 1818 in Trier, Germany, Marx was raised in a society undergoing profound transformation. Industrialization was reshaping Europe, bringing immense economic growth, but also deepening social divisions. The factory system created vast wealth for the few, while subjecting the many to grueling conditions, long hours, and precarious livelihoods. The promise of Enlightenment progress stood in stark contrast to the visible suffering of the working class. Marx, keenly observant of these contradictions, sought to understand their underlying causes. His early education immersed him in the philosophy of G.W.F. Hegel, whose dialectical method would profoundly shape Marx's own thinking. Hegel viewed history as a process driven by conflicting ideas, culminating in the realization of human freedom. Marx, however, saw a crucial flaw in Hegelian idealism. It emphasized abstract concepts rather than material conditions. Reality, Marx argued, was not driven by the clash of ideas alone, but by the struggles rooted in economic and social structures. This departure marked the beginning of his materialist conception of history, a shift that would define his later work. In the 1840s, Marx encountered the Young Hegelians, a group of radical thinkers who sought to challenge religious orthodoxy and traditional authority. While initially drawn to their critique of ideology, he found their approach lacking. It remained too focused on ideas rather than material forces. Ludwig Feuerbach's writings offered a crucial stepping stone. Feuerbach argued that religious beliefs were not divine truths, but human projections shaped by earthly conditions. Marx extended this logic to the entire realm of ideology, arguing that political, legal, and philosophical beliefs were ultimately rooted in economic structures. This realization led to one of Marx's most enduring insights: human beings are shaped by the conditions in which they labor. In his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, he developed the concept of alienation, describing how workers in capitalist society become estranged from their own labor, from the products they create, from their fellow human beings, and ultimately from their own humanity. Unlike artisans of the past who could take pride in their craft, industrial workers were reduced to cogs in a machine, performing repetitive tasks dictated by the pursuit of profit. Alienation for Marx was not just an economic condition, but a fundamental distortion of human existence, a theme that would remain central to his critique of capitalism. Marx's break from idealism was not merely a theoretical shift, but a profound reorientation of how history, society, and power should be understood. Rather than seeing history as the unfolding of ideas or the progress of reason, he came to view it as the outcome of material conditions, shaped primarily by economic structures and the conflicts they generate. This insight laid the foundation for what would become historical materialism, the idea that the way people produce and distribute material goods determines the broader organization of society, from its legal institutions to its cultural norms and philosophical outlook. The significance of this approach was its emphasis on class struggle as the engine of historical change. For Marx, history was not a smooth, linear progression toward enlightenment, but a series of conflicts between dominant and subordinate classes, each era marked by the tensions of those who controlled the means of production and those who laboured under them. He traced this dynamic across different epochs, from ancient slavery to feudal serfdom, and now to capitalism, where the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, stood in opposition to the proletariat, the working class forced to sell their labour to survive. Unlike previous systems, capitalism had refined exploitation into something more abstract, where control was not exerted through direct coercion, but through economic necessity. This analysis provided a revolutionary way of understanding social structures. In the German ideology, written with Friedrich Engels, Marx developed the idea of the base and superstructure. The base, composed of the economic system, including labour, property relations, and productive forces, was the foundation upon which the superstructure rested. The superstructure in turn encompassed politics, law, religion, culture, and ideology. Far from being neutral or independent, these elements served to reinforce the interests of the ruling class, legitimising the economic order and naturalising exploitation. The function of ideology, then, was not simply to reflect reality, but to obscure it, presenting capitalist relations as fair, inevitable, or even natural. Marx argued that capitalism, while historically necessary in advancing productive capacity and technological development, contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very forces that made it dynamic, competition, innovation, and relentless pursuit of profit, would also drive its contradictions to an unsustainable point. Capitalist expansion required the continuous exploitation of labour, but as capitalists sought to maximise efficiency and reduce costs, workers would be left in increasingly precarious conditions. Over time, this would heighten economic crises, create greater concentrations of wealth, and deepen social unrest. Marx saw this not as a temporary dysfunction, but as an inherent feature of the system. Capitalism's success, he believed, would ultimately be its undoing, as it created the very conditions that would lead workers to revolt and seek a new form of economic and social organisation. Marx's theory of class struggle was not an abstract philosophical proposition, but a historical force that he believed shaped all societies. The antagonism between those who owned the means of production and those who laboured within them was, for him, the defining feature of capitalism. Unlike earlier modes of production, where relations between rulers and ruled were often bound by tradition, feudal obligations, or religious doctrine, capitalism reduced these relationships to purely economic transactions. Labour was no longer tied to land or guilds. It became a commodity, bought and sold in the marketplace like any other. This transformation, while immensely productive, also created a new form of alienation in which workers had no control over the conditions or products of their labour. In the Communist Manifesto, co-authored with Friedrich Engels, Marx described the relentless dynamism of capitalism, noting how it compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. The pursuit of profit forced capitalists to continually revolutionize production, leading to technological advancements and an ever-expanding global market. But this same process also exacerbated inequalities, concentrating wealth into fewer hands while leaving workers increasingly vulnerable to economic crises. The very competition that drove capitalism forward ensured that small businesses would be swallowed by larger enterprises while workers faced downward pressure on wages and job security. This ceaseless expansion created what Marx called the reserve army of labour, a class of unemployed or underemployed workers who could be used to keep wages low and discipline the workforce. By ensuring that there was always a surplus of labourers in need of work, capitalists could maintain control, preventing workers from demanding higher wages or better conditions. This, in turn, made collective action more difficult, as workers were kept in a state of economic precarity, always aware that they could be replaced at any moment. Despite these obstacles, Marx believed that capitalism would ultimately create its own gravediggers. As industrialization concentrated workers in urban centers, it also fostered collective consciousness. Unlike peasants in rural economies who remained largely isolated, factory workers labored side by side, experiencing the same exploitation and developing shared grievances. Over time, these conditions would forge class solidarity, making large-scale organization and resistance possible. Marx saw unions, strikes, and workers' movements not as incidental struggles, but as signs of an emerging proletarian consciousness, a recognition that workers had common interests and that their liberation could only come through collective action. For Marx, revolution was not simply a moral imperative, but a historical necessity. The contradictions within capitalism, he argued, would push the working class towards self-emancipation, leading to the overthrow of bourgeois rule and the establishment of a new social order. The question was not if this transformation would happen, but when. Marx's analysis of capitalism extended beyond class struggle to a deeper critique of the economic system's inner workings. In Das Kapital, he sought to expose the hidden mechanisms of exploitation that underpinned industrial society. One of his most important contributions was the concept of surplus value, the idea that capitalists extract profit by paying workers less than the value of what they produce. While wages appear as a fair exchange in the marketplace, they obscure the fundamental inequality of the system. Workers generate more wealth than they receive, and the difference is accumulated by capitalists as profit. This, for Marx, was the core injustice of capitalism, a system that depended on extracting unpaid labour from the working class. This process of accumulation was not just exploitative, but also inherently unstable. Capitalists driven by competition sought to increase productivity by introducing new technologies and improving efficiency. While this lowered production costs and expanded output, it also led to periodic crises of overproduction. Factories would churn out goods faster than they could be sold, leading to layoffs, bankruptcies, and economic downturns. Unlike earlier societies, where scarcity was the primary economic challenge, capitalism created the paradox of abundance, an economy that produced more than people could afford to consume. The system's relentless expansion meant that crises were not anomalies, but inevitable cycles, each one exposing deeper contradictions within the mode of production. Marx also identified a tendency within capitalism toward monopolization. As firms competed, some grew larger and more powerful, driving out smaller competitors. Over time, industries became dominated by a handful of corporations, consolidating control over production and distribution. This concentration of wealth and power, he argued, would erode the very market dynamics that capitalism relied upon, limiting competition and making the economy increasingly vulnerable to collapse. The drive for profit would push capitalists to extract even greater surplus value from workers, intensifying exploitation and social unrest. Beyond economic instability, Marx argued that capitalism alienated people from their own humanity. Labour, once a source of creativity and fulfillment, had become a means of survival, dictated by the demands of the market. Workers had little control over their tasks, their working conditions, or the final products of their labour. Instead of shaping the world through purposeful activity, they became instruments of production, subordinated to the logic of profit. This alienation extended beyond the workplace, permeating social life, relationships, and even self-perception. People were valued not for their intrinsic qualities but for their economic utility, reducing human existence to an endless cycle of work and consumption. For Marx, these contradictions made capitalism unsustainable. While it had unleashed unprecedented productive forces, it had done so at immense social cost. The system's internal conflicts would, in time, create the conditions for its own negation, setting the stage for a transformation beyond capitalism itself. Marx did not see capitalism's contradictions as abstract theoretical concerns, but as forces that would ultimately shape the course of history. His theory of historical materialism suggested that economic systems were not static. They evolved through internal struggles, giving rise to new modes of production. Just as feudalism had given way to capitalism through social upheaval, Marx believed that capitalism would eventually be replaced by a socialist system. However, this transition would not happen automatically. It required conscious political action driven by the working class as it became aware of its collective interests. The process of revolution, in Marx's view, was not simply about changing political leaders or redistributing wealth within the existing system. It required a complete transformation of society's economic foundations. The state, as it existed under capitalism, was not a neutral institution, but an instrument of class rule, designed to maintain the power of the bourgeoisie. While liberal theorists saw the state as an arbiter of justice and individual rights, Marx argued that these rights were largely formal, serving to obscure deeper inequalities. The legal and political structures of capitalism ensured that property relations remained intact, making true economic emancipation impossible within the system's existing framework. To break this cycle, Marx called for the dictatorship of the proletariat, a transitional stage in which the working class would seize control of the state and use it to dismantle capitalist structures. Unlike bourgeois revolutions, which had replaced one ruling class with another, the goal of the proletarian revolution was to abolish class distinctions altogether. This stage was not meant to establish permanent rule by the workers, but to create the conditions for a stateless, classless society. Once private property and exploitation were eliminated, Marx envisioned that the state itself would wither away, as there would be no ruling class left to enforce its authority. Marx was critical of reformist approaches that sought to humanize capitalism rather than overthrow it. While he acknowledged that social programs and labor protections could improve conditions temporarily, he argued that they did not address the fundamental logic of the system. As long as capital remained concentrated in the hands of a few, economic power would continue to shape political power. Parliamentary democracy, he believed, was largely a facade offering the illusion of representation while maintaining economic hierarchies. However, Marx's writings on revolution left many questions unanswered. He was deeply engaged with historical struggles, such as the revolutions of 1848 and the Paris Commune of 1871, but he never provided a detailed blueprint for what socialism would look like in practice. Instead, he insisted that the specifics of post-capitalist society would be determined by historical conditions, shaped by the actions of the working class itself. Marx's influence did not end with his own writings. His ideas were taken up, adapted, and put into practice by revolutionaries and theorists across the world. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of socialist movements that sought to apply Marx's theories to their own historical contexts. Nowhere was this more evident than in Russia, where Vladimir Lenin expanded on Marx's ideas to develop a theory of revolution suited to a largely agrarian society. While Marx had envisioned socialism emerging from the most advanced capitalist economies, Lenin argued that a revolutionary vanguard could accelerate this process by seizing state power and restructuring society from above. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 marked the first successful attempt to establish a Marxist-inspired state. Lenin and his followers sought to abolish private property, redistribute land to the peasantry, and place industry under state control. However, the transition was anything but smooth. The Russian Civil War, economic instability, and external pressures forced the Soviet government to take measures that Marx had not explicitly envisioned. The state, rather than withering away, became increasingly centralized, consolidating power in the hands of a single party. Dissent was suppressed, and the original revolutionary ideals often took a back seat to the demands of maintaining control in a hostile international environment. This trajectory raised a crucial question. To what extent could these developments still be called Marxist? While Lenin justified his policies as necessary adaptations, critics argued that they departed from Marx's vision of proletarian self-emancipation. Later, under Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union pursued rapid industrialization and collectivization, but at a staggering human cost. Forced labor camps, political purges, and mass famine undermined the claim that this was a government of the working class. Detractors, including many within the Marxist tradition, contended that the Soviet model represented not the realization of Marx's ideals, but their distortion. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, other Marxist thinkers sought alternative paths. The Frankfurt School, composed of philosophers like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, analysed how capitalism had evolved to absorb and neutralise revolutionary impulses. They argued that culture, media, and ideology played a greater role in maintaining social control than Marx had originally accounted for. In their view, mass consumerism and entertainment created passive populations that were less inclined to challenge the status quo. Other theorists, such as Antonio Gramsci, emphasized the concept of cultural hegemony, exploring how ruling classes maintained power not just through force, but by shaping public consciousness and defining what was considered common sense. As Marxism spread beyond Europe, it encountered new challenges and adaptations. Thinkers like Mao Zedong in China and Frantz Fanon in colonial Africa reinterpreted class struggle in terms of national liberation and anti-imperialism, showing that Marx's ideas, far from being static, continued to evolve in response to historical conditions. As Marxism expanded beyond its European origins, it was shaped by the unique conditions of the societies that adopted it. In China, Mao Zedong reinterpreted Marxist theory to fit the realities of a largely agrarian nation. Unlike Marx, who saw industrial workers as the driving force of revolution, Mao placed the peasantry at the centre of socialist transformation. He argued that rural populations, long oppressed by feudal landlords and colonial interests, could form the backbone of a revolutionary movement. The Chinese Communist Party's strategy of protracted guerrilla warfare reflected this adaptation, mobilizing millions of peasants in a struggle against both imperialist forces and domestic elites. When the revolution succeeded in 1949, China embarked on a program of land redistribution and collectivization, radically reshaping its economy and social structure. However, like the Soviet Union, China's revolutionary government did not achieve the classless society Marx envisioned. Instead, it developed into a highly centralized state with power concentrated in the Communist Party. Mao's policies, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, led to economic turmoil, widespread suffering, and political purges, raising further questions about the compatibility of Marxist ideals with authoritarian governance. In the Global South, Marxist thought was often intertwined with anti-colonial struggles. Frantz Fanon, a theorist and revolutionary from Martinique, applied Marxist analysis to the dynamics of colonial oppression. In The Wretched of the Earth, he argued that colonialism created a distorted class structure where native elites acted as intermediaries for imperial powers, while the majority of the population remained impoverished. Fanon saw violent resistance as not only necessary for liberation, but also psychologically transformative, allowing the oppressed to reclaim their humanity. His ideas influenced numerous revolutionary movements from Algeria to Latin America, where figures like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro combined Marxist principles with national liberation struggles. Latin America became a significant site of Marxist experimentation, particularly through movements that sought to challenge US economic dominance. The Cuban Revolution of 1959, led by Castro and Guevara, established a socialist state just miles from the United States, provoking intense geopolitical conflict. While Cuba implemented widespread social reforms, including universal healthcare and education, it also faced economic hardship and political repression. The US response, including trade embargoes and covert interventions, exemplified the broader Cold War struggle in which Marxist movements were often suppressed by Western-backed regimes. Marxism's evolution in these diverse contexts demonstrated both its adaptability and its limitations. While it provided a powerful framework for analysing inequality and exploitation, its implementation often diverged from Marx's original vision. The question remained whether these adaptations were distortions or necessary adjustments to historical conditions. As the 20th century progressed, new challenges emerged, forcing Marxist theorists to grapple with the failures and contradictions of existing socialist states while rethinking the possibilities of revolutionary change. By the late 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the economic liberalization of China led many to declare the end of Marxism as a viable political force. The dissolution of the USSR in 1991 seemed to confirm the triumph of capitalism, with Francis Fukuyama famously proclaiming the end of history, arguing that liberal democracy had emerged as the final stage of political and economic development. Western policymakers and intellectuals pointed to the failures of centralized planning, state repression, and economic stagnation in socialist states as evidence that Marxism was not only outdated but fundamentally flawed. The dominant narrative suggested that market economies, despite their inequalities, were more adaptable and resilient than their socialist counterparts. However, Marxist theory did not disappear. Instead, it underwent transformation, adapting to new conditions and incorporating insights from other intellectual traditions. Thinkers such as David Harvey, Nancy Fraser, and Slavoj Žižek revisited Marx's critique of capitalism, applying it to the realities of globalization, financialization, and the digital economy. Harvey, for instance, analysed how capital had shifted from industrial production to speculative finance, creating new forms of instability. The 2008 financial crisis reinforced many of Marx's predictions, exposing the contradictions of deregulated markets and the fragility of an economy driven by debt and speculation. The resulting economic insecurity, rising inequality, and declining social mobility led to a resurgence of interest in Marxist critiques of capitalism. At the same time, new social movements began to integrate Marxist analysis with other critical perspectives. Feminist scholars like Silvia Federici and Nancy Fraser examined how capitalism relied on unpaid reproductive labour, highlighting the ways in which economic exploitation intersected with gender and social reproduction. Post-colonial theorists such as Achille Mbembe and Walter Mignolo explored the relationship between capitalism and imperialism, arguing that historical structures of racial and economic domination persisted in new forms. These developments pushed Marxist thought beyond its traditional focus on industrial labour, broadening its scope to include a wider range of struggles against economic and social domination. Meanwhile, debates over climate change and ecological destruction further revitalized Marxist critiques of capitalism. Scholars such as Jason W. Moore and Andreas Malm argued that capitalism's relentless drive for profit was fundamentally at odds with ecological sustainability. The concept of metabolic rift, developed from Marx's writings on nature and labour, described how capitalist production disrupted the natural cycles of reproduction, leading to environmental crises. The push for degrowth, eco-socialism, and a Green New Deal reflected growing recognition that capitalist expansion could not continue indefinitely without catastrophic consequences. Rather than fading into obscurity, Marxist thought continues to evolve, responding to contemporary crises and adapting to new political realities. As inequality deepens and environmental challenges escalate, Marx's critique of capitalism remains a powerful tool for understanding and challenging the structures that shape modern society. Despite the persistence of Marxist thought in academic and activist circles, the political landscape of the 21st century presents new challenges that complicate traditional revolutionary frameworks. The globalization of production has fragmented the industrial working class that Marx saw as the primary agent of historical change. Factories that once concentrated workers into a cohesive social force have been replaced by decentralized supply chains, with labor outsourced to different parts of the world. This shift has made collective organizing more difficult, as workers in different regions face vastly different conditions, wages, and legal protections. The traditional image of the proletariat as a unified revolutionary class is less clear in an economy dominated by precarious employment, automation, and platform capitalism. At the same time, capitalism has proved more adaptable than Marx anticipated. Rather than collapsing under its contradictions, it has restructured itself in response to crises. The financial sector has expanded its influence, generating profit not through the production of goods, but through speculation, debt, and the manipulation of markets. New technologies have created digital economies that blur the lines between labour and leisure, with workers engaging in unpaid digital production through social media, gig work, and data generation. Surveillance capitalism, as described by theorists like Shoshana Zuboff, extends capitalist exploitation beyond the factory floor, commodifying personal data and shaping behaviour through algorithmic control. These developments raise questions about how Marxist theory should adapt to economies that are no longer centred on industrial labour. Furthermore, political resistance to capitalism has taken new forms, often diverging from traditional Marxist class analysis. Social movements centered on racial justice, gender equality, and LGBTQ+ rights have gained prominence, sometimes aligning with economic critiques, but at other times operating independently of them. The tension between class-based and identity-based struggles has led to debates within the left about strategy and priorities. Some argue that capitalism cannot be meaningfully challenged without addressing intersecting forms of oppression, while others caution against fragmenting resistance into separate identity-based movements that fail to address the root causes of economic exploitation. Meanwhile, state power has shifted in ways that complicate Marxist predictions about proletarian revolution. Rather than being swept away by socialist uprisings, capitalist states have developed sophisticated mechanisms of control, including mass surveillance, media manipulation, and legal restrictions on protest. The failures of 20th century socialist experiments have also led to widespread skepticism about state-led economic planning, making it harder to mobilize large-scale movements for systemic change. As a result, many leftist thinkers today focus less on seizing state power and more on building alternative institutions, from cooperative enterprises to decentralized networks that challenge capitalism from below. Despite these challenges, the core insights of Marx's critique remain relevant. The contradictions of capitalism, its tendency toward inequality, instability, and ecological destruction, continue to generate crises that call its long-term viability into question. Whether these crises will lead to transformation or simply new adaptations remains an open question. As capitalism continues to adapt and reinvent itself, the question remains whether Marxist thought can offer a viable alternative, or if it is destined to remain a critique without a clear pathway to transformation. While Marx predicted that capitalism's contradictions would ultimately lead to its downfall, history has shown that the system has an extraordinary capacity to absorb crises and reconfigure itself. Governments have introduced welfare programs, regulatory measures, and stimulus policies that mitigate some of the most extreme effects of economic downturns, delaying or preventing the revolutionary ruptures Marx anticipated. Yet even these interventions often serve to stabilize capitalism rather than fundamentally challenge its logic. The rise of digital capitalism has further complicated traditional Marxist analyses. The proliferation of algorithm-driven economies, artificial intelligence, and data commodification has created new forms of exploitation that Marx could not have foreseen. Labour has become increasingly fragmented, with workers atomized across global networks and subjected to algorithmic control rather than direct oversight by a human employer. Platform capitalism, embodied by companies like Amazon, Uber, and Meta, has blurred the boundaries between work and daily life, making it harder to identify clear lines of class struggle. At the same time, new forms of digital resistance have emerged, from labour organising among gig workers to grassroots movements using social media to mobilise collective action. Whether these strategies represent a new form of class struggle or a more diffuse, less revolutionary form of resistance remains debated. Ecological crisis presents another critical challenge that Marxist thought has had to grapple with. While Marx recognised the unsustainable nature of capitalist production, contemporary eco-socialists argue that the urgency of climate change requires a more immediate break with the system. The relentless drive for profit has led to environmental destruction on a global scale, from deforestation and biodiversity loss to rising carbon emissions and the depletion of natural resources. Some argue that capitalism's growth imperative is fundamentally incompatible with planetary boundaries, necessitating an economic system based on sustainability rather than accumulation. Proposals such as degrowth, eco-socialism, and a Green New Deal seek to integrate Marxist critiques with ecological priorities, advocating for a transition away from fossil fuel dependency and toward a more just and sustainable economic model. As these debates unfold, the question of political strategy remains unresolved. While some advocate for electoral approaches, seeking to implement socialist policies within existing democratic frameworks, others argue that true systemic change requires a radical break with capitalist institutions. The tension between reform and revolution persists, reflecting the broader uncertainty about what a post-capitalist world might look like. Marxism, far from being a static ideology, continues to evolve, shaped by new historical realities and emerging struggles. Whether it remains a critique of capitalism or becomes the foundation for a new economic system is a question that history has yet to answer. As capitalism faces mounting crises, economic inequality, environmental degradation, and political instability, the relevance of Marx's critique has only grown. Yet, the pathway to an alternative remains uncertain. The 21st century has seen a resurgence of leftist movements, from anti-austerity protests in Europe to labour strikes across the world. However, these movements have struggled to coalesce into a unified force capable of enacting systemic change. The power of multinational corporations, financial institutions, and neoliberal states remains formidable, and past attempts at revolution have left a complicated legacy. The failures of state socialism have cast a long shadow, with many questioning whether any large-scale alternative to capitalism can avoid the pitfalls of authoritarianism and inefficiency. One of the defining features of modern capitalism is its ability to integrate and neutralize opposition. Where Marx saw class struggle as an inevitable and escalating conflict, contemporary capitalism has developed sophisticated means of absorbing resistance. Social movements are often co-opted, with radical demands softened into market-friendly reforms. Cultural critiques of capitalism are commodified, turning anti-establishment symbols into corporate branding. Even critiques of labour exploitation have been transformed into new business models, where corporations position themselves as socially conscious while maintaining fundamentally exploitative structures. This ability to adapt and reframe opposition poses a significant challenge to Marxist politics, raising the question of whether capitalism can be meaningfully contested within its own framework. At the same time, new technological developments present both opportunities and challenges for anti-capitalist movements. The decentralization of information through the internet has allowed for greater global coordination, with activist groups using digital platforms to organize protests, share knowledge, and challenge dominant narratives. However, the same digital landscape is also shaped by corporate monopolies and state surveillance, making grassroots organizing increasingly precarious. The commodification of data, artificial intelligence, and algorithmic control have introduced new forms of exploitation that extend beyond the workplace, embedding capitalist logic into nearly every aspect of daily life. These developments suggest that any future transformation will require not only economic reorganization, but also a fundamental shift in the relationship between technology, labor, and power. The challenge for Marxist theory today is not only to critique capitalism, but to articulate a clear and viable alternative. While movements advocating for worker cooperatives, universal basic income, and public ownership of key industries represent attempts to address systemic inequalities, they often fall short of the transformative vision Marx envisioned. The lack of a cohesive revolutionary strategy has left Marxist politics fragmented, with some focusing on reformist policies, while others maintain that only a radical break with capitalism can achieve lasting change. As history continues to unfold, the struggle between capitalism's adaptability and the potential for systemic transformation remains unresolved, ensuring that the debate over Marx's legacy is far from over. Marx's legacy remains deeply contested, not only by critics of socialism, but also among those who seek to build upon his ideas. While his critique of capitalism has proven prescient in many ways, the practical implementation of Marxist-inspired systems has been fraught with contradictions. The failures of 20th century socialist states to achieve the kind of classless, stateless society Marx envisioned have led many to reconsider the pathways to post-capitalist transformation. Some argue that these failures were not inherent to Marxist theory, but rather the result of historical circumstances, external pressures, and deviations from Marx's original principles. Others contend that the very structure of centralized planning and state control contradicts the emancipatory vision that Marx articulated. One persistent challenge is the role of the state in the transition from capitalism to socialism. Marx anticipated a phase in which the working class would seize control of state institutions, using them to dismantle the structures of capitalism. Yet, history has shown that revolutionary governments, rather than gradually dissolving, often consolidate power, entrenching bureaucratic rule. The question of whether a socialist society can be achieved through democratic means or whether revolution necessarily entails coercion remains a point of contention. Some contemporary movements advocate for a decentralized socialism, rejecting the Leninist model in favor of worker cooperatives, participatory democracy, and local economic autonomy. Others argue that without centralized planning and control over key industries, capital will always find ways to reassert dominance, making revolutionary change incomplete. Another difficulty lies in the complexity of modern global capitalism. In Marx's time, national economies were more self-contained, with industrial production largely concentrated within individual countries. Today, capitalism operates through intricate global supply chains, transnational corporations, and financial markets that extend beyond national borders. This makes the prospect of socialist transformation more complicated, as no single nation can fully extricate itself from the pressures of the global economy. Attempts to implement socialism in one country, as seen in the Soviet Union and later in Cuba and Venezuela, have often faced economic isolation, trade embargoes, and internal inefficiencies, limiting their ability to sustain themselves in a capitalist-dominated world. Despite these obstacles, interest in Marxist thought persists, particularly among younger generations disillusioned with the status quo. Economic inequality, job precarity, climate change, and political instability have fueled renewed debates about capitalism's long-term viability. The question that remains is whether a new form of socialism can emerge, one that avoids the mistakes of the past while addressing the realities of the present. If Marx's work has taught anything, it is that history is never static. Economic systems rise and fall, shaped by the struggles of those who live within them. Whether capitalism will remain the defining system of the future or give way to something new is a question that continues to unfold. Marx's unfinished legacy continues to shape debates about the future of economics, politics, and society. His work was never intended to be a fixed doctrine, but rather a method of analysis, a way to understand the structures of power, production, and class struggle that define each historical moment. While past attempts at implementing Marxist-inspired systems have faced significant challenges, his core insights remain relevant in a world still marked by extreme inequality, economic crises, and environmental collapse. The contradictions he identified within capitalism have not disappeared. They have evolved, taking new forms in an era of financial speculation, digital monopolies, and ecological limits. The persistence of these contradictions suggests that capitalism may not be as invulnerable as its defenders claim. Rising wealth concentration, corporate consolidation, and the erosion of traditional labour protections have produced growing dissatisfaction, even in the world's most advanced economies. The appeal of leftist ideas has surged in recent years, with movements advocating for higher wages, universal healthcare, wealth redistribution, and alternatives to privatised industries. However, whether these efforts represent a pathway towards systemic transformation or merely attempts to reform capitalism remains an open question. The challenges of globalization, technological automation, and environmental collapse raise fundamental concerns that incremental policy changes may not be able to address. At the same time, the failures of past revolutions and the disintegration of 20th century socialist states have left deep skepticism about whether Marx's vision can ever be fully realized. The notion of a stateless, classless society remains an aspirational goal, but its practical implementation has proven elusive. Efforts to create new models of socialism, whether through cooperatives, decentralized governance, or democratic planning, face the reality of competing in a global market still dominated by capitalist logic. Even within socialist experiments such as worker-owned enterprises, market forces often reassert themselves, leading to compromises that Marx might have seen as structural limitations of the system itself. Yet history remains unwritten. The conditions that shape society today are not permanent, and the struggles of the present will define the possibilities of the future. If Marx's legacy has any enduring lesson, it is that capitalism is not the end of history. Economic systems change, new forms of resistance emerge, and the possibility of transformation remains open. Whether the future will bring new adaptations of capitalism, a resurgence of socialist alternatives, or an entirely unforeseen system is impossible to predict. What is certain is that the questions Marx raised about power, labour, inequality, and the nature of human freedom will continue to be debated as long as economic and social hierarchies exist. His work endures, not as a blueprint, but as a challenge to imagine a world beyond the limits of the present. Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform